Howdy folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is the Hiby R5 Gen 2. So this is the latest digital audio player from Hiby. Yes, an MP3 player for the layman out there. And yeah, this is the new R5G2, which is, as it suggests, a sequel to the R5, which itself already had a couple of different variations. There was the original R5, and then the R5 Saber, which I actually reviewed on this channel. And now we've got the Gen 2, which is the first one to come in a completely different body design. In fact, this is a much larger screen, as we will see in a little bit. But that's not the only difference here. The other big difference, at least the other big headline difference that Hiby is touting, is that the R5 Gen 2 has got a Class A amplifier built into it. And given those differences, and given the fact that over the past year or so, since I reviewed the R5 Saber, that player basically became my go-to digital audio player, and I was really curious to see what have they changed over the past year. Is it just the size? Is the Class A thing just a gimmick, or is there actually something here worth getting excited about? And the short version is there is something to get excited about here, and I don't think it's either of those two features, my opinion. So, like all my other reviews, this is a live stream. If you're watching now live, you have any questions about the R5 Gen 2 that I don't get to in this review, stick around. At the end of the review, we'll do a little bit of a live audience Q&A, and hopefully I can answer all of your burning questions. Otherwise, shout out to Hiby for sending this thing in for review. If you want to check them out, there is a link to Hiby in the description down below. But otherwise, let's just jump to the table, start talking about what comes in the box first of all. And I guess maybe a bit of an agenda on the review here, because this is a digital audio player. The format will be a little bit different. I'm going to start by talking about the physical stuff here on the R5 Gen 2, and we'll talk about the software experience, and then finally we'll talk about the sound, and I'll give this thing a score and a conclusion at the end. But before we get into that, let's just do a quick tour of the packaging and what you get inside of it. So it's fairly straightforward. Hiby R5 box. In fact, I think the box says Gen 2 on the outside of it, which is interesting. But yeah, fairly simple box. What you get inside of it, also pretty simple, to be honest. You do get a plastic screen protector. This is just like a pretty typical plastic screen protector. And in fact, there were two additional screen protectors pre-installed on the device. I took them off because I'm not a big fan personally of these plastic screen protectors. They're not like oleophobic. They spoil, I think, the touch screen interface a little bit. But if you are concerned about, scratches and stuff like that, you can leave them on. And they were pre-installed on both the front and the back of this device. Additionally, they also include a pretty standard USB cable. So it's got USB-C on one end, USB-A on the other end. Ostensibly, you would use this for charging the device, although it will charge over any standard USB-C charger. And then other than that, you also get actually a pretty decent little carry case. So this is the standard carry case that comes with the R5. It's kind of like let me punch it on that so you can take a look at it up close. It's a pleather design. I think it's a handsome blue, but it's got one big problem, at least for me. Yeah, maybe I'm overstating it as a big problem, but I don't like that this case covers up the buttons. So you can kind of see this is what it would look like over the top of your volume buttons on the left-hand side. And I'm not a big fan of that. Now you might notice over here, this side's not covering the buttons, and that's because I went crazy and I actually cut a hole in it for myself. That is how I prefer a carry case like this to work. I want to be able to have clear physical access to the buttons. Not the least of which because the buttons on this, which we'll talk about in a little bit, they are all a little bit samey feeling. And when you are using this player through a case and feeling it just by feel, right? You're not looking at it. It can be a little bit difficult to discern the buttons with the case on. So it is a nice case in terms of the build materials and the size of it. Like, it's not overly bulky, but I really do wish that the controls were not covered up like that. Anything else to talk about what comes inside the box? I honestly don't think so, because that's about it. So let's just go ahead and dive into talking about the physical stuff on the unit itself. And I guess we'll start with the general build, the external stuff before we get into the nitty gritty. But yeah, here you go. The one thing that's worth calling out about this player, well, there's going to be a lot of things worth calling out. The thing I want to start with, though, is a thing that's also true of the older R5, and that they've just covered this thing in glass to an extent I think is unnecessary, but I guess it does give it a nice feel. So, right, it's got, of course, an all glass screen up front. It's also all glass here on the back. Additionally, there's even a glass panel here on the top of the unit, which is interesting. The surround of the unit is, I'm assuming, some sort of an aluminum metal, which also wraps around the bottom and on both sides. And I don't know, for the most part, like, it really does have a nice feel in the hand. It's got a bit of weight to it. It is a little bit weighty, right? If you're used to your smartphone, I would say this is heavier than your average heavy smartphone because it is a little bit on the thick side too. But it feels nice. It feels, you know, every bit of what, $450 that it costs. Let's see. While we're talking about the glass screen, I mentioned I removed the screen protectors because I didn't like the feel that they had. Like, they weren't quite smooth and glossy to the touch. I generally prefer glass like that, but unfortunately the glass here, Hiby doesn't seem to have treated it with much of like an oleophobic coating or anything like that. So as you might be able to see back here, I even wiped this down before doing this review, just handling it. It is a bit of a fingerprint magnet. It's also, because it doesn't seem to have that oleophobic coating, it's a little bit on the, I don't want to say grippy side, but it's not as smooth and sleek feeling as some other, you know, nicer glasses. Now, the plus side on that is that this thing doesn't actually slide around on my couch the way that, there was like some FiO, with a FiO BTR5, that thing would not stay still on my couch because it was like just coated in oleophobic coating all over the place. So that much is nice, but I don't know. I do wish that the front screen at minimum had an oleophobic coating to prevent some of the fingerprinting that is pretty much inevitable here. Other than that, let's talk about, man, I keep activating that thing. The form of this thing is also a little bit different, not just in terms of size, but also in shape and external design. They've added these angles. I'm trying to get this to show up on camera. Maybe I should do it from this angle. But the edges are a little bit on the chamfered side. That's probably not quite the right word, but they are a little bit angled. And you feel that a little bit in your hand. I feel like this is not as nice to hold in the hand as the older Hiby R5, partly because of those angled edges, and also partly because it's just a larger unit, and I tend to prefer smaller electronics. But of course, the trade-off is that you do get a much larger screen. I would say for me, you know, this size is actually still nice and one hand handleable. Is that a word? We'll go with that. I think this is still a very good one-handed device, unlike something like, you know, this was the FiO M11 Plus that I recently reviewed. Also a really nice unit, very well built. Man, this thing is chonky enough that thing is no longer one-handable. This thing, I think, is still one-handable. It's got those kind of sharp edges that you do feel a little bit, but yeah, it's not the worst. I've used some other digital audio players where it's actually uncomfortable to use. And I did mention the screen size is up. Let me go ahead and pull in. This is the older Hiby R5 for comparisons, so you can kind of get a sense for how much bigger the screen is. Here on the new R5 Gen 2, I believe it's a 4.7 inch screen. This one's just a small little 4-inch screen. So depending on your preference, you might actually prefer that. I was totally fine with the small screen here because I'm not using my digital audio player for watching videos or anything like that. I'm just scrolling songs or lists of music. And the smaller screen size is fine for that, but you know, I'm not going to complain about it here. The resolution is up a little bit on this as well. It's a 720p resolution screen, so not super high res, but honestly, at a 4.7 inch screen, still smaller than most smartphones, so the PPI, whatever, it's still good. I think everything actually looks really nice and crisp on this screen. The one, I think, pretty obvious downside to this screen, or sort of a downgrade, is in brightness levels. And for me, this is actually not a big deal, but I'll mention it here because I know a lot of people will probably be using devices in different environments than I do. The brightness on the screen just is quite dim. So let me go ahead and compare it to the original R5, or this is the R5S. So I've just maximized the screen brightness, and you can kind of see where we're at with that. And then I'll go over here to the last year's R5, and I don't know if it's totally obvious to you, but it's definitely obvious to me that this is the brighter, more vibrant screen. For me, it's not so much a big deal because I actually end up using my devices, my digital audio players, at reduced brightness because I'm primarily using them indoors, and I'll use them, you know, even in bed and stuff like that. And so I don't want the screen to be especially bright. But if you are planning to use one of these things outside, just a fair warning that the screen brightness on this unit is a little bit of a downgrade versus the last year's model. Let's see, anything else about the physical stuff to talk about? I mean, while we're on the topic of the screen, there is actually kind of an interesting, this is also a software issue or a software feature that not a lot of digital audio players support, but there is like a double tap to wake function. That's pretty cool. Most digital audio players don't support that. And as an iPhone user, that's kind of a feature I take for granted. So I do appreciate that here. So I think that will do it for kind of the build quality and the screen stuff. Let's talk a little bit now about the input and output on this device, which, you know, it's all the basic stuff that you would expect. And in fact, most of it's on the bottom, but we will start over here on the side. You do have, of course, your micro SD card slot for expanding the memory. In fact, I think this thing comes with about 16 gigabytes of built-in memory, and half of it is taken up by operating system. So I would just consider that you have to buy this thing with a micro SD card slot. Totally normal for digital audio players, so it's not a downside or anything. But what I do appreciate is that the SD card slot is accessible without like a SIM ejector tool or anything like that. I can just press this and eject the card easily without any tools, and I like that. Other than that, as far as input output, let's go here on the bottom, and I apologize, this will probably be out of focus. But you've got, of course, USB-C charging here in the bottom, as well as you've got 3 different headphone jacks. Okay, so they've got support for both single-ended 3.5 millimeter, naturally, as well as you've got balanced outputs, both in 4.4 millimeter and 2.5 millimeter. That is a difference versus last year's R5 Saber, where we had 3.5 and 4.4, but no 2.5 millimeter. Personally, yeah, I'm actually a little bit surprised to see them reintroduce the 2.5 because it felt like we were going the direction of sunsetting 2.5, but I'm still seeing it every once in a while. So if they're going to keep it around, if, you know, manufacturers are going to keep making cables for 2.5, I guess it's nice that Hiby includes that here on the bottom of their device. The only thing, like really the only thing I would suggest to Hiby to potentially make this better is I think it would be a good idea to take the USB-C port and put it on the top of the unit. That's a thing almost nobody does. I think iBasso does that, and I like it. Almost nobody does, so that's not a complaint. But if you're looking for a way to make it better, that's a little pro tip there for you, Hiby. But yeah, that's the physical stuff. That's the I/O. I think now we can talk about the buttons, which you've probably already gotten a little bit of a view on before, or as I'm handling this thing, but let's go over the buttons real quickly. So they do, like on some of their other players, they separate the volume and general control buttons. So on the left side, if I'm facing the device, you've got your volume buttons, volume up and down, and then over here on the right side is where you've got your power button, and then you've got play, pause, and then track. This is next track button, and that's previous track button, which is actually the layout I like. I remember commenting on this when I was first getting into digital audio player reviews that I feel like growing up, at least in the US, right, up was always next track and down was previous track. But when you're browsing lists of music, I actually think that it makes more sense that down equals next track. So I like the players that do that, and the Hiby R5 Gen 2 is one of them. As I'm talking about the buttons, you know, the one thing that is worth calling out is that the buttons, and I mentioned this a little bit as I was talking about the case, the button design is not super differentiated. So if you're using this unit by feel, and frankly, I think buttons are like the main reason I want a digital audio player, is I want to be able to use a thing like this by feel, put it in my pocket, you know, use it in bed without turning on the lights or anything like that. And I need to be able to use this thing by feel. The buttons are a little bit on the samey feeling side. It's a word. And because of that, it just means that as I'm using this thing, you know, in the dark or using this thing blind, I do have to feel around for it a little bit and orient myself. It would be nice maybe if the play button had like a notch or something on it that would make it very clear that my thumb was on the play button, and very easy to orient myself that way. Otherwise, I don't know, is there anything else I wanted to talk about the buttons? I mean, I mentioned that the carry case unfortunately makes the buttons a little bit on the difficult side to discern. You can kind of see how there's just not much to feel there. But I don't know, it is what it is. I do find myself honestly just ended up preferring to use this unit without a case because of that. And yeah, I think that's going to do it for the physical stuff. So let's just dive in now and talk about the software experience. And software on players like these, it you know, can range from nightmare material or just kind of annoying stuff, but also, you know, because these are Android based, pretty customizable in a lot of ways. The first thing worth talking about on this player though, and it's a little bit of a disappointment, is that this is still using the same version of Android that was on the older Hiby R5. In fact, this is Android 8.1, which when this thing came out was already feeling a little bit old, but now we're like a year and a half past that. You know, Pixel users are using Android 13 or something like that at this point. And this thing's still stuck on Android 8.1, which is a bit of a disappointment. And frankly, given the fact that it's been, you know, this one never got an upgrade from 8.1 to anything newer, I would not hold my breath on this thing being updated to anything newer. Now, the plus side is, even with Android 8.1, I've never actually found any apps that won't install and that don't work. I'm sure there is stuff out there that's not compatible with 8.1, but all of the things that I've wanted to do on an Android player have been able to work out of the box, and so I'm not too worried. In fact, you may notice, you might not even notice, I've got a different launcher here. I like to use the Android launcher called Niagara. Just gives me a nice clean look, and it works here perfectly fine. And frankly, with Niagara launcher, like, I don't know, this feels about as modern as most Androids. It's just, you know, you do worry about long-term compatibility and maybe security stuff, but I don't know, I'm not much of a security nut, if I'm perfectly honest. That's not the only thing that's the same here on this unit versus the older unit. Another disappointing thing is that the processor on this thing is exactly the same SoC that they use in this. It's like a Snapdragon 425 or something like that, which that doesn't matter too much. I'll just say this, that I ran Geekbench scores on both of these units. They both scored exactly the same. So like, it's not just the same on paper, it's the same exact performance, which, you know, it's pretty decent performance, honestly. And I'll give you some demonstrations of how this thing scrolls. I think, you know, well, let's jump into the app and I'll show you around. This is the stock Hiby app. Zoom in on that so you can get a little bit closer look. And you can see is like scrolling performance is not bad. It's actually pretty good. It'll chunk a little bit as it's loading in box arts. But for the most part, performance using the stock Hiby app is pretty decent. Where I think the processor starts to let this down a little bit is when you're using streaming applications. And the ones that I'll show here real quickly are, let's say, Spotify. So you can kind of get a sense for how long it takes to launch Spotify from fresh. This feels like it's taking a little bit longer than it normally does, if I'm perfectly honest, but there you go. And then again, like just kind of like the scrolling performance as it's loading things in, it's a little bit on the chunky side. Once things are loaded in, scrolling performance is actually pretty decent, but it is a little bit chunky there. And I think that that's an area where they really could have stood to make an improvement with a new unit, not just because it's a year later, but this thing's also, you know, $50 more expensive than this unit was. And it's coming in with the same software and the same hardware, the same processor. It's a little bit of a disappointment, at least for me though, honestly. I don't really use streaming apps that much, right? I use them for testing this stuff, but for the most part, I'm using the stock music app, or actually found myself recently using PowerAmp. And the performance of PowerAmp on this thing is actually pretty phenomenal. PowerAmp seems to perform better than the stock Hiby app. So if you are also a power amp user, you will probably find that enjoyable. But for the most part, we'll stick to looking at the stock Hiby app. As we're talking about the stock Hiby app, this is just the thing that's notable is that, you know, most of these digital audio players will come with their own stock music apps, and usually they have some sort of like exclusive access to the DAC and like the audio system, so that if you really want bit perfect sound, you should be using the stock apps. If I were to rank all of the stock apps, and this was a thing I just kind of did on paper, and I actually think was worth talking about, right? So I've used digital audio players from Hiby, of course. I've used them from Sony, Fio, anything else? Oh, Ibaso. And then just for good measure, I downloaded the stock Shanling app. I've never used the Shanling DAP, but they do have their app in the App Store. And I downloaded that just to kind of get a sense for them and how I would rank them. All right, this is the important ranking. I would say that Sony's Walkman app for their Android-based Walkmans, that's my number one favorite. My number two is actually probably the Hiby stuff, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail. But this I would actually rank as like my number two favorite stock music app. Number three is probably Fio, then Shanling is after that, and then Ibaso I think is the one that kind of stands out as I don't like the Ibaso app. So just to give you a sense for, you know, overall how I rank the software experience on the Hiby app, I think it's actually pretty good. I do still have some quibbles, but to start with, like just to highlight some of the things that I do like about this thing. So one, and this is going to be like a really simple thing, is that it supports, what am I doing? Oh, I'm on my music. I'm just playing music. I meant to be on a artist list. All right. So one thing that I like that it does is it supports, you know, just basic swiping gestures. So you can go back, you can navigate backward with swipes. A lot of apps don't do that, and it's not a big deal, I suppose, but I do like that. I like that the software, or sorry, the library updating on this thing is actually really quick. Like you just navigate over here, you tap music scan, and it will go through. You know, let's just do it for good measure. Let's scan all of my music. This is how long it takes to scan a library of about 4,000 tracks. Some players are really just dog slow at this, and in fact, my old R5 was never bad. It was actually always pretty good, but it seemed like with some software update, it actually got to a point where it's a lot faster. And so just generally, I've come to appreciate how fast Hiby scans my music. What else that I want to talk about? You know, I like that it just uses your stock box arts. It doesn't try to load in box arts for album arts or anything from the internet. These are like really kind of simple things. You can also play all songs by an artist, which feels like that should be just an expected feature, but not all digital audio players will let you do that. So yeah, generally, like most of the things that I like to do on a digital audio player, this one does it pretty well. There are, like I mentioned, a couple of quibbles that I have, and we'll see if this thing will finish building the database. It's almost done, right? And so that was for about 4,200 songs, so not a tiny music library, and you know, that was pretty quick. But a couple of things that I think, you know, my small quibbles, right? So one, when it's alphabetizing music by artist, and this is the primary way that I navigate my music, right? As I navigate, I go into an artist, click in erasure, I find an album I want to listen to, and then I listen to that album. One of the things that this does, and this is kind of like a dice roll in which way a device manufacturer is going to do it, is that this will alphabetize artists, including the word "the" at the beginning, all right? So for example, if I go down to my T's, here's where I've got the Chameleons, the Cranberries, the Cure, the Japanese House, the Knife, the Marias, the Midnight. Like all of my "thes" end up under T. And this is, again, we're talking quibble territory here, but I definitely prefer the alphabetization that puts the Cure under C. So there you go, small quibble there. The other small quibble, and this one's actually a little bit more significant, but we'll still put it under small quibble because this still does a better job than a lot of other players. Let me find an example, right? FKJ, right? Let's say I wanted to listen to every album of FKJ in order. you can't really do that. Like I can go to, what is it? This button navigates me to a view of all the songs, and then it puts them in alphabetical order. So I can listen to every song by FKJ in alphabetical order. But what I would really love to do is just hit play on this one, listen to that one front to back, then go into this album, listen to that album front to back, etc., etc., etc. And there's no real option to do that here in the Hiby app. So again, another little bit of a quibble, but there you go. And then the last quibble is that there's just some features in here that I've never ever used, and maybe that's on me. But the Hiby app has got some features in it that I don't use, and because of that, I don't know, it just looks a little cluttered. So for example, this up here, ostensibly I can log into this device and upload my avatar. I've never done that. I'm never gonna do that. Sorry, Hiby. And because of that, I've just always got this blank avatar in my UI. There's also some other stuff over here, the Hiby Link controller. That's fine. I'm not going to complain about that because I know some people use that. But there you go. Mostly I just don't like that I've got a blank avatar there all the time. But that is definitely being pretty nitpicky. I did mention you can, of course, use other music apps, right? I'm using Power Amp primarily is what I've been listening with. And one thing I mentioned that a lot of the times with digital audio players like this, you actually still want to use the stock app just because they'll have kind of like a preferred level of access to the audio hardware on the unit if you're concerned about the bit perfectness of your digital audio. I'm not usually one to be that concerned about that stuff. That to me is a little bit in placebo territory, but it is worth noting that the R5 Gen 2 Hiby advertises that they've actually got some sort of software trickery where other apps are actually able to play high resolution through the DAC that's built in here, which is pretty cool. Now, Power Amp seems to be one of the apps that doesn't actually do that. I mean, I can play high res through Power Amp, but it's through Power Amp's own resampling or whatever. But other apps, like, what did I use? Like Sony Music Center, that one accesses high res. I was able to play it, and then through the UI, I confirmed that it was actually playing. Because up here, let's see, let me start some music real quick, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Up here, it shows you the sample rate of the music that you're listening to. And most of the time, when I was like on this older device, if I'm using third-party devices, this will always read 44 kilohertz. But even if I'm playing like a high-res music. But this device, the newer one, it seems to let apps access the higher sampling rates. I don't know. What I was getting at was basically, I know some people were asking me, like, if I was listening to Apple Music lossless, would I be able to listen to them in high res and stuff like that? And I think so. Unfortunately, I don't have an Apple Music subscription anymore, so the only way I was able to verify with that was through Sony's app, which seemed to work right. So that's my best attempt at answering that question. Again, not a thing that I put a lot of importance into, the bit perfectness, but there you go. Another quibble, and this is more to do with the operating system itself. This is a thing that Hiby's always done, and I'm not a big fan of it, but as you're changing the volume, you get this UI that takes over the screen, and it is nice that it lets you like quickly, increase the volume. You could quickly max out the volume or quickly drop it down, but I don't really love that it takes over the screen like that. I wish there was a way to disable that. And then also on the volume complaints, I do wish that the volume steps were a little bit more controlled, especially down low. So I'm primarily using this audio player listening to IEMs. They're very sensitive. I don't need a lot of power, but at lower audio volumes, it does feel like the gaps between volume steps are a little bit on the large side. It wasn't like a super big annoyance, but again, a thing that the R5 Saber, this one, they actually patched in a software control that lets you change the way that the volume ramps up, and this one, because of that, I like better. Maybe they'll patch that into this one at some point. And then I guess the other thing that's really worth talking about this thing, and this is kind of software experience level or related, but also kind of not. But I think really the big standout feature on this player, and I probably should have mentioned this before we got to this point because it's been a while. But the big standout feature for me on this player is the battery life, okay? most Android-based audio players, you make some sort of sacrifice by having the flexibility of Android. And I think for me, it's generally been, I prefer having Android audio players, but you know, I do miss like my first digital audio player, the Sony NWA-45, had like 30 to 40 hours of battery life. It was not Android, but it had a really good battery life, and I loved that about it. Since then, right, the R5, this one, the R5 Saber, the battery life in this is not bad. It was like 18 hours claimed battery life. I felt like it was actually really good for my purposes. And I had no complaints about the battery life, but again, it's still not nearly as good as my old Sony Walkman. But here with the R5 Gen 2, the claimed battery life on this thing is 35 hours. And that's phenomenal. And I'll say that in practice, I haven't timed it exactly at 35 hours or anything like that. But in practice, I'm charging this thing like every 3 or 4 days. And for me, that is awesome. The battery life, I am super, super impressed on this thing. I will say that 35 hours of battery life, they say it's in economy mode, which just means you're not using the Class A amplifier. Like I mentioned up front, this thing has a Class A amplifier in it, but that's not like the default option. You have to opt into Class A amplifier. If you're just using the standard Class D economy mode amplifier, basically the same amplifier you would get in any other digital audio player. That's where you get your 35 hours of battery life. If you do switch over to the Class A amplifier, that battery life drops considerably, as I would expect. It comes down to about 10 hours of battery life because Class A amplifiers are just known for being power hungry. So for me, yeah, we'll talk a little bit more in a bit about what that Class A amplifier means for the sound. But for me, those battery life advantages just meant that I pretty much stuck in the economy mode on this device. Okay, a couple of last things that we'll talk about before we get into the sound is the radios, right, on this thing. This thing's got Bluetooth and it's got Wi-Fi. A couple of notes. The Bluetooth performance on this thing seemed pretty good. I didn't test it extensively, but I did test the Bluetooth range with my FiO BTR5, and it seemed like the range on this about matched my Sony Xperia 10, which is like a cheaper Android phone. It seemed like it was pretty good. Nice solid connection, but the range wasn't phenomenal. I mean, part of that is definitely to blame on the FiO BTR5, but that's why it's actually kind of a good test, because the range in the FiO BTR5 is not great. If the thing it's connecting to is really good, it can extend the range of it. And this, it was pretty average. The other thing worth calling out is that I was doing some speed tests on this device, not because I really care about what the internet speed is on this thing, but sometimes that, like, running Wi-Fi to its extremes can actually have an impact on the sound. But I was doing those tests, and one thing that stood out as I was doing those tests here on this device is that the maximum download speed was actually kind of slow. It just seems like the Wi-Fi radio on this thing is a little bit slower than my iPhone, for example. I didn't do a comparison with this or other Android players. Maybe they all have slow Wi-Fi radios, but it was a thing that stood out to me as I was testing. Okay, so we've talked about the physical stuff, the screen, what it's like in the hand, the buttons, the software experience, and a bunch of other stuff, but we haven't yet talked about what does this thing sound like. And I'm gonna give you the preamble up front. Look, most of the time when I'm talking about sound differences between sources, I really don't hear that much difference. The main things where I will hear differences are, one, let's say output impedance, right? If the output impedance on a source is high and you're using a sensitive earphone that can, I don't know, sometimes the frequency response can be noticeably changed by a source. That's absolutely a real thing. So that's the thing to look out for. There is amplifier hiss, or just sound floor, right? If you are plugging in a sensitive IEM, again, to like an average smartphone, pretty common, you'll hear a very audible hiss, and that level of hiss can kind of vary depending on which device you're using. That's a very noticeable difference for me. And then the third difference is going to be like power output levels, volume. How loud does a thing get, right? So those are kind of the areas where I look for sound differences. If you're looking for a lot of commentary on the sound differences in terms of sound stage and detail retrieval and stuff like that, my stance is in general is that is pretty placebo-y. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist at all. It's just that anytime I do hear those differences, I feel like they're so minor that they disappear when I'm not doing a really close A/B test. And because of that, I just don't really care about that stuff. So with that preamble out of the way, let's go and talk about how this thing stacks up on sound quality, okay? So I mentioned output impedance. I don't have a way of measuring the output impedance on this unit, but I do have a Maga OCK5. It's like an all balanced armature earphone, very sensitive, very, very susceptible to tonal shift if the output impedance on a digital audio player or source is high. And connecting that to this, it sounded perfect, right? So I think the output impedance on this thing is appropriately low. And if you're worried about using sensitive IEMs on this thing, I don't think you got to worry about that. On the same the same line of thinking is the noise floor, the sound floor, right? Again, sensitive IEMs are going to pick up a noisy amplifier. And on this thing, it's basically dead silent. So if I am using, again, that Maga OCK5, the way that I test sound, in fact, let me demonstrate this real quick. I have, where do we have that file? Is at the bottom? I have a test audio track that just plays nothing. All right, I call it the sound floor track. It plays nothing except a beep every like 5 seconds or something like that. So I can play it, I can hear that it's playing because it's making a beep. But if I hear a hiss or if I don't hear a hiss, that's a good sign. That's a good sign that this thing is not hissing. And this player, I think, performed actually really quite admirably with noise floor. Again, using my most sensitive earphone, I can maybe pick up like the hint that there was a hiss, and that was only when using that sensitive earphone on balanced connector, which usually has a little bit more noise floor, and on high gain. So with those things all true, I could make out that there was a hiss, but it was definitely not going to be audible over music. And frankly, I think that's pretty outstanding performance here on the Hiby. Maybe it is worth calling out, I believe when I enabled the Class A amplifier, the noise floor was more noticeable, but it was still, I think, pretty negligible. But if you are really sensitive to noise floor, maybe the Class A amplifier with something like a Campfire Audio Andromeda might be a thing that turns you off. But frankly, again, I think it was pretty minor. When I was doing those speed tests, I mentioned like trying to test the Wi-Fi radio to see if like sometimes that kind of stuff can interfere with the sound output. I heard nothing. Again, using that silence track to really stress test this thing, and then running a speed test that was just downloading, as fast as this device could do. Never had any issues with it interfering with the sound. So really pretty phenomenal there. And then I guess, let's see, while we're on the topic of talking about this Class A amplifier, if I'm perfectly honest, man, I don't hear a difference. I think when I switch over to the Class A amplifier, it feels like it does get a smidge louder, right? Just going from economy mode to Class A amplifier, it seems like it gets a smidge bit louder, which might have the effect of making you think that it sounds a little bit better, but it's like, it's pretty negligible, the sound difference. And to be honest, like, it sounded the same to me. So apart from the fact that the Class A amplifier did have a little bit higher of a noise floor, which is kind of to be expected, apart from that small difference, like, I don't hear a difference. So I know some people are really enthusiastic about Class A amplifiers. It's cool that Hiby has included that here for people who are into that sort of thing, but for me, definitely not a selling point. And because of that, like, I don't feel bad about using this thing in economy mode and reaping the benefits of that 35-hour battery life. I guess I might as well talk about, the DAC and hardware that's in this thing. So this unit, the Hiby R5 Saber, this one used all Cirrus Logic DACs. This one now they've switched over to ESS DACs, if you care. Not a big deal for me either way. I would say, listening to these things back and forth, like, they sounded indistinguishable to me. When I did pull in my FiO M11, this one, again, I did find that the DAC on this sounds a little bit cleaner in the treble, just a little bit smoother. Like, it takes the edge off things in a way that might be placebo, but I do like it a little bit better. But again, it's like a difference that if I'm not doing that sort of very careful A/B testing, it just disappears. And so as far as I'm concerned, this is a phenomenal sounding digital audio player. I didn't talk about power output. Let's talk about power output. It's actually worth talking a little bit about. Let's see, the rated output on this device, right, at 32 ohms, which is a pretty standard way to rate that power output, on balance connector is 564 milliwatts, so about half a watt. Actually, pretty incredible power output, frankly, on a little digital audio player like that. On this player, it's actually down a little bit. On a balance connector, the at 32 ohms, it's only 320 milliwatts of output power. If you go up to the Class A amplifier, you do actually get more output power. It goes up to 475 milliwatts of power. Still a little bit lower here actually than on the R5 Saber, which might be a bit of a downside. Like, this thing is actually less powerful than this smaller audio player. But here's what I will say. Using my Sennheiser HD600, right, a 300 ohm headphone, not the ohm is the only thing, but it's probably the least sensitive headphone that I own. Listening on this player on 3.5, no, actually I was listening on the balance connector, but I was listening to it on low gain. Like, even on low gain, I was getting plenty of power output, and I was not cranking the volume or anything like that. So, you know, depending on your own personal loudness preferences, it's possible that the difference in power output between these two would be meaningful, but for me, it's completely meaningless because, again, on low gain, I had no reason to even go into high gain. Didn't have any reason to go into medium gain, let alone high gain on this device. So for me, the fact that this thing rates at a little bit lower power output than this unit doesn't matter at all, because this thing's giving me a lot better battery life for that, and that's a trade-off that personally I'm definitely willing to make. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to talk about. I don't think so. So let's just dive into, finally, after this long and lengthy review, let's talk about the conclusion. My final thoughts here on the Hiby R5 Gen 2 out of 5 stars. I think this thing is very, very solid. In fact, this is probably going to be my go-to recommendation for most people for a digital audio player that's Android. I'm giving it 4 stars out of 5. I think, if I'm being picky about it, right, the complaints is that it's still using an older operating system, or sorry, it is an older operating system. It's Android 8.1. It's a little bit of a disappointment. I think the bigger issue is that the SoC is still a Snapdragon 425. For me, for my uses as a non-streamer, it's actually totally great. Like, it runs power amp phenomenal. But if you are a streamer, right, it's gonna be a noticeable downgrade in performance versus most people's smartphones. And that does give it a little bit of a caveat, but otherwise, look, this is a great sounding digital audio player. Got all the performance that I need, and I think good enough performance for most people. It's got the right buttons, it's got good software, despite it being a little bit out of date. And it's got phenomenal battery life. 35 hours for an Android-based audio player is frankly pretty unreal. And I think because of that, this is gonna end up becoming my day-to-day digital audio player. So, if you are interested in checking out the Hiby R5 Gen 2, I do have a link in the description down below. And again, shout out to Hiby for providing this for review. While you're down there, if you found this video helpful, please hit the like button. It helps me out. Subscribe to the channel, helps you out. And then ding the YouTube bell, which helps somebody out sometimes, right? I don't know, maybe. But you ding the bell and YouTube will let you know next time I'm live, and then I will catch you on the next super review, unless you're here live now, in which case, hang out and let's chat about some digital audio players after I grab a sip of herbal tea.